Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tammy Stackelhouse, fibromyalgia coach, author, and founder of the International Fibromyalgia Coaching Institute. The goal of this podcast is to empower you with access to the dream team of experts and coaches I've discovered are key to living the fibro life you love. From the comfort of your own home, and maybe even your pajamas, I'll help you take back control of your life and health. To help out with fibro fog, I always include full show notes and additional resources at fibromyalgiapodcast.com. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tammy Stackelhouse, and this is episode 107. In today's episode, I want to share some tips for how you can know who you can trust online. With the launch of ChatGPT in December 2022, it's become easier and easier for people to use AI, artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, to write things like blog posts or create podcasts, even write whole books. And AI, while it can be a helpful tool, the work AI generates has to be edited by a human expert that actually knows their stuff. Otherwise, it's all too easy to spread misinformation or even disinformation. Now, if you are not familiar with ChatGPT, let's start there. If you're a tech industry or like me as a podcaster, as an author, we've been talking about ChatGPT a lot, but it might not be something that you're familiar with. So ChatGPT is essentially a very complicated program that is designed to answer questions, to write stories, to create new things with information and prompts given by you. This was launched back in the public, like I said, back in December 2022. So the information that was pre-trained into ChatGPT was knowledge prior to 2021. Now, they probably have got a plan for how to update that knowledge base, but keep in mind that the information that is contained inside of that could be old information, right? Like having an old edition of encyclopedias for those of you old enough to remember paper encyclopedias, or an out-of-date Wikipedia article. Now, it is also possible that the information that was pre-trained, so the information plugged into it as its knowledge base, could have a bias. All of us have biases, right? Medication is good. Alternative therapy is questionable. That's a bias that many Western medicine doctors hold. A lot of us also have the opposite bias where natural therapies, nutrition, food, supplements, that is good, but medication is bad. We all have a bias. So keep in mind that anything that is generated by an artificial intelligence that has a bias, that information generated is going to have a bias. It's also possible that it has been pre-trained with wrong information, right? Obviously, I'm sure they didn't try to give it bad information, but sometimes we have misinformation simply because it's the best we know at the time. I think a great example of this is the COVID pandemic, right? The information we were being told at the very beginning was much, much different than the information that we know now. And so things that may have been written or programmed in back from the beginning of the pandemic could be misinformation simply because that is what we believed at the time. The other thing about AI, about ChatGPT, that is a little bit on the scary side is that it can sound very authoritative, even when it is completely wrong. And I'm going to share an example of that with you in just a minute. It is really, really important that there is a human being, an expert involved with AI. They are not at the place where they are like God, know all, right? It only knows what it knows. And so it might not be the things that we know as experts, right? So using fibromyalgia as an example, there is a lot of stuff that I know that is not in a book, maybe my book, but some of it isn't even in there because some of it is just the practical day-to-day living with things and how to do things in a different way. That is not necessarily science or research, it's more practical experience. Entrepreneur.com has an article dated February 15th, 2023, and it is talking about how ChatGPT works. So we will have a link to this article in today's show notes, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/107, and that'll be out there for those of you who want to learn more about ChatGPT. But as the article was talking about using this tool in healthcare, the article says, more than any other industry, humans must double check the reliability of ChatGPT's information to ensure safety. When we're talking about fibromyalgia, we fall into that healthcare category because we're talking about a health condition. We might not be nurses or doctors, right? We're coaches. But even as a patient searching for articles, it's medical information that I'm looking into. And we want to make sure that those articles and things that are written are double checked by a human for reliability and to ensure safety. So I'll give you an example here. I am married to a rocket engineer. He loves tools like this. And so he has been playing around with ChatGPT since December. There have been lots and lots of hysterical things that he has created. My husband has quite the sense of humor. And so one day he asked ChatGPT to write a blog post on, quote, debunking the myth, you can't catch fibromyalgia from eating popcorn, end quote. Now, just to be clear, there is no myth about catching fibromyalgia from popcorn, nor can you catch fibromyalgia from eating popcorn. But my husband, with his sense of humor, this is what he programmed into ChatGPT. And ChatGPT did give us a whole long blog post. And the information in that blog post was not wrong, but not accurate either. Let me read just a couple of sentences for you. This is from the blog article that ChatGPT wrote. Quote, however, there is a popular misconception that fibromyalgia can be caught from eating popcorn. The origin of this myth is unclear, but it likely stems from the fact that some people with fibromyalgia have reported experiencing pain and tenderness in the jaw. Popcorn kernels can sometimes get lodged in the jaw, which can cause pain and discomfort. However, this does not mean that eating popcorn can cause fibromyalgia. End quote. So as you can see, this article is not exactly incorrect, except for the fact that there is no popular misconception. That part is 100% incorrect. There is no popular misconception about fibromyalgia being caught from eating popcorn. But the rest of the information is kind of true, right? A lot of us do have TMJ issues. We do have pain and tenderness in the jaw. Yes, popcorn kernels sometimes kind of get caught in there and it can cause pain and discomfort, particularly if you have TMJ. But this doesn't mean that eating popcorn can cause fibromyalgia, which is the correct answer. And that is word for word exactly what ChatGPT said. So that's kind of a good example of how it sounds very authoritative. It sounds correct, even though it is creating something from a completely imaginary point of view. And if you think about this as, it is a computer program. It simply created what we asked it to create. It did not verify our information to see if it was correct. This would be the same if you were using something like ChatGPT to create a story. We could Have ChatGPT write a story about how the sky is green and the grass is red, right? And it would do that because that is the information that we've programmed into it. Now, the tricky part with all of this, and the reason that I'm explaining all of this about ChatGPT to you, is that more and more people, writers, podcasters, entrepreneurs, businesses, are using tools like ChatGPT to create content, to create blog posts, podcasts, books. And they do that to save time and energy. As you guys all know, I've written a couple of books, and my publisher, she has used ChatGPT to help create outlines for their authors to be a starting point. Sometimes it can be hard to work with a blank page, so it's easier to edit than to write from scratch. So using ChatGPT, certain prompts, they can create an outline, but then a real person has to go through, a person who has the real experience and expertise has to go through and edit that. But if you don't have that integrity, and if you are just trying to generate a lot of information quickly, or if you don't have that expert to double check everything, you could generate a lot of content that is incorrect, which means that we as consumers need to know what to look for. How do we know that the information we're reading is correct? And so I'm going to give you 11 tips for how you can know who to trust. By the way, if you want to learn more about ChatGPT and how it works, we will definitely have links to a couple of different articles on our show notes page. Just go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/107. So a few weeks ago at our Alumni Association meeting, I asked our graduates, how do you know what to trust? And we came up with a list of 11 different things that you can look at to help you know if the information you're reading is accurate, if it's a source you can trust. Number one, who is it written by? Where is it published? Is this something that is on Johns Hopkins website or a Mayo Clinic website? Or is this some random.com? And when you go to find the About section to see who owns this website, you can't figure out who it's owned by. There are tons of websites out there that are creating content mostly to be able to advertise to you. These websites typically will have a lot of spam on the page. There will be tons of ads on the page. So if you go to a website, if you're reading an article, if you see something shared on social media or somebody emails you a link, that's the first thing I would be looking at. Who is this? Who is providing this information? So I would be looking for who the author of the article is, but sometimes that's not always totally helpful because, for instance, you might not know the person at Johns Hopkins, but you know Johns Hopkins. You don't know the person at the Mayo Clinic who wrote the article, but you know the Mayo Clinic. So look at both the author, but also look at who owns that website. That's number one. Who is it written by? Where is it published? Number two, keep in mind that doctors are not necessarily knowledgeable. A good example of this is fibromyalgia. How many times have you been to a doctor that said they did not believe in fibromyalgia? Now, of course, I'm not saying don't believe any doctors. That's not what I'm saying at all. But don't just automatically believe something because it was Dr. So-and-so. For example, you might be called Dr. So-and-so, but your doctorate is in education, and it has nothing to do with medicine, right? You might see something about Dr. So-and-so, but they're one of the doctors that believes fibromyalgia doesn't exist. There are lots and lots of views out there, so I would do a little bit of additional research if it's a doctor that you don't recognize, if it's not, Dr. Ginevra, who was on our last episode. Now, if it's not somebody like that and you don't know them, do a little bit more research and see, is this somebody who actually does know what they're talking about, right? I had a friend who wanted to introduce me to a doctor to be on his podcast. And when I listened to his episode on fibromyalgia, I could tell it was one of those doctors who thought fibromyalgia was a fake diagnosis. So be careful. Don't just trust because it's a doctor. So that's number 2. Number 3, take a look at the web address. Does it end in .com? Does it end in an unusual ending, right? Like .biz or some other odd ending? Is it .edu or .org? In many cases, .edu and .org can be more reputable because those two endings are designed for edu, for education, right? So you will find, for instance, medical schools putting out information or blog posts at .edu. .org is designed for nonprofit organizations, so you might find information at .org. .com is for commercial purposes. That's what we use most of the time. Most websites are going to be .com. So that's not necessarily a good indicator, but if it's one of those odd ones, even .coach, .online, there's lots and lots of them. I would question those because usually somebody is using that ending because a normal ending was not available. So they're kind of a little bit of a different sort of website. So that's number 3. Check the actual URL, and if it's a .edu or a .org or a .com, it's probably more reputable than if it's one of those odd endings. Number 4, show me the data. This came from one of our coaches, and she said she always thinks of Jerry Maguire. Show me the money. But she says, show me the data. And what she means by that is there data to back up the information that's being presented? It is one thing to share from your personal experience. Here's what I've found with what I've done. But it's another thing to say, this is how something is. Fibromyalgia is XYZ. Where does that information come from? Show me the data. If you're saying that this particular supplement is helpful for fibromyalgia, where's the data to back that up? We want to be careful about just accepting things that people say are true without actually having the proof that it's true. So take a look at the data. This might mean that you have to do a little bit of research, and Google Scholar can be a huge source for this. If you go to scholar.google.com, you can look up any studies that have been done. So if somebody is sharing the data, you can go look that up, right? That's number 4. Show me the data. Number 5, same coach. She said, I know this sounds kind of childish, but she always thinks, says who? So when you're reading an article, maybe you're reading a blog post or you're reading a book, and it says in there, according to something, or as reported by, or any of those other citations, we've learned that. Well, who? And make sure that the people that they're quoting or the things that they're referencing are reputable. I could write a great article and include all kinds of quotes and links by those doctors who say that fibromyalgia isn't real, and write an article that actually has citations and has quotes and says who. But when you research who that person is, maybe we don't want to take their opinion. Maybe their quote is biased or inaccurate. So, says who? Anytime you see that, according to, as reported by, or other citations, don't just accept it as truth because there's a citation. Make sure you look up who that is, what that is referring to. And along with that is number 6. Does the article, does the blog post, the book, the podcast, whatever, are they listing references for the studies? Are they listing references for the quotes so that you can go look it up? I mean, I could tell you right here, right now that Dr. So-and-so said something, and I could completely make that up. And there is no Dr. So-and-so. Or I could quote something like I quoted the entrepreneur article earlier and give you that link, and you can go read it yourself and read it in context. It's one of the reasons why I've included so many links in my book, so many references in my book, so that you could go look at those studies yourself. And I try to do that here on the podcast as well, because I think it's important for you to be able to verify that and to read the context of things. So that's number 6. Are they listing references? I do want to give a caveat here. ChatGPT can include references. But again, if we are including references of people who have misinformation, it's still references, but it's not good information. So you want to check those out yourself to see if the context is correct and accurate. Number 7, if they are quoting studies, is it a valid study? So here's some ways you can know if it's a good study or not. Look at the sample size. If it's a study of 1, that's going to give you a lot different information than if it's a study of 1,000,000, right? Not to say that individualization is bad, it's absolutely not, but it tells us different things. You also want to look at how long was the study. If you study something with fibromyalgia and you study it for a few weeks or even a few months, you might miss out on the big old fibro flare that's coming down the road. But if you are following a particular study for a year, a couple of years, that again tells you something very different. I also heard this example somewhere, if it's a study on what happens with women named Nancy, then that is telling you something different than if we're looking at what happens with all women, right? So take a look at the studies themselves. Don't just say, oh, it was a study, it's good information. Not that studies are bad when they're small, they're not. In fact, a lot of times we have to do a pilot study, a small study, in order to obtain funding to do a bigger study. But the information that it gives us is different information. If we know something worked for a few people, that's different than if we know it works for a lot of people. So take a look at those studies and see how the study was run. What did they study? How long did they study? How many people were in there? How did they choose their study participants? Things like that. All right, number 8. Ask yourself, how does this information align with what I already know to be true from other sources? Now, you can occasionally have somebody who has an incredible breakthrough and changes the world as we know it, or medicine as we know it, or fibromyalgia as we know it. But chances are, what is going to happen is you're going to have somebody who adds to the information we already have. So if you have somebody who is giving you information that doesn't jive with anything else you know to be true, then you want to research it more. You don't necessarily want to just throw it out and ignore it, but it is a sign that you need to dig deeper and you need to see if there's more to this. Also, use that to help you know about the writer's bias, right? If you are reading an article that talks about how CBD oil is bad, we have a clear bias there, right? So definitely take a look and dig deeper. That bias may match up with how you feel, or it may not, but it is a signal for you to dig deeper and really help you understand a little bit further where the author is coming from, where the information is coming from, and whether that fits with everything else. Number 9, this is kind of a tricky one. Is the source, so wherever this article is posted, whoever is publishing the information, are they giving you value or are they only selling things? Now, the reason that I said this is kind of tricky is because a lot of the research that is being done that is not on pharmaceuticals is paid for by the people who are selling the thing. Because honestly, we're the only ones who care about it. Right? So, a lot of the research that's being done on really anything, fibromyalgia, anything else, is funded by pharmaceutical companies because they are testing out new drugs or they are researching new drugs they could potentially make. But for things like coaching, for example, pharmaceutical companies are not going to pay for a study on coaching. They have no interest in that. It doesn't help their bottom line in any way. In fact, it might hurt their bottom line. If you work with a coach and they help you get off some meds, that definitely doesn't help that pharmaceutical company. So, if you were to see a study on coaching for fibromyalgia, which there has been one, it was done by a coaching company, not mine, another company. But those are the kinds of things where it can be difficult and you want to be careful. And that's why I say, are they giving you value or only selling? Obviously, I make my money as a coach. The only way this podcast can exist is by me selling coaching. If people don't enroll in coaching, if they don't enroll in my training programs, I don't get paid. I don't have money to create this podcast. At the same time, this podcast is not one continual ad, right? Like I'm giving you value. And yes, somebody somewhere has to sell something or we don't have the money to create it, right? So keep in mind where that funding is coming from. Selling isn't all bad, but it can sometimes be bad. So, for instance, we've all stayed up too late and seen infomercials on TV. We've all done it, right? And if you go to one of those websites for one of those products that's on that infomercial, you might see a lot of information and a lot of data, but it is all coming through the lens of them trying to sell you something. So they're going to share the positive testimonials and not the negative, for instance. So if it is information that is coming from somebody who is selling you something, I'm including myself in this. Also check and see, are you getting value for this? Is it only an ad? And what is the purpose of this? If it's valuable to you, totally fine. But definitely double check things. Make sure that it's not just one big ad. Number 10, is it individualized information or generalized information? This one can also be a little bit tricky because obviously we are not writing a book for a single person like Susie over here. It is written for a group of people, but there's a place for individualization. So, for instance, on this podcast, you'll hear me say a lot that this is for you if it's not for you, if it's this category over here, right? So, maybe medication is the way you have to go, or maybe it's not the best way for you to go. And sharing both sides of the picture is what helps make the information more individualized. A good example of generalization is that blog post that ChatGPT wrote for my husband. A lot of the other information in that post was very, very general. It had really no specifics about fibromyalgia at all. It was just very vague. Fibromyalgia is a chronic pain condition, those kinds of things, but not really digging into the specifics of what fibromyalgia is and how it affects individuals. So think about that. Is this very general information or is this more specific and individualized information? I guess specific is probably a better word than individualized, but are we niching down? Are we getting down to the specifics or is this very general? One of my students put it like, it's like a fortune cookie message. It could apply to anyone. Good news is going to come from someone close to you, right? It's very, very general. And so you want to look at the articles, the posts, the podcasts that you're listening to, and really look at, is this like a fortune cookie message, or is this a deeper dive, more specific, more individualized? And number 11, the last one on our list of tips, is really to build that list of go-to sources that you trust. Hopefully, this podcast is one of them. Dr. Ginevra Lipton, she's one of my go-to sources that I trust. My doctor, Kaylee, Dr. B, she's been on the podcast a couple of times. She's another source that I particularly trust. Maybe you trust things like Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic. There are a lot of sources out there. And as you read things, as you explore, you will find some that resonate with you more or less. And you can build that list of sources that you trust. So, for example, if you hear maybe about a new supplement that's supposed to be super helpful for fibromyalgia, you can go then to that list of sources that you have and see what information they have on that topic. So we'll use magnesium as an example because it's the first thing I thought of. But somebody tells you need to take magnesium. It'll cure your fibromyalgia. Well, go check out Dr. Ginevra's YouTube channel. Does she have episodes on magnesium? I bet you she does. What does she say about it? Do we talk about magnesium here on the podcast? I don't know. I actually don't know if we have, but those would be things that you could take a look at. You could pull out my book and take a look and see what do I say in there about magnesium? I know it's in my book. Things like that. Go to the sources that you trust to check the information that you aren't sure about. So that's our list of tips. I do have a few more tips for you, and I want to share with you the poem that Scott wrote for me using ChatGPT. But I want to recap these tips for you real quick first. Number 1, who is it written by? Where is it published? Number 2, doctors are not necessarily knowledgeable about every topic, so do your research. Number 3, what's the URL? Is it a .edu, a .org, a .com, or is it some other weird URL? Number 4, show me the data. Do they have any data to back up their information? Number 5, says who? When you see as reported by, look at who that is, and is that somebody you trust? Number 6, do they list references for studies and quotes? Number 7, if they're quoting particular studies or research articles, is it a valid study? Was it well done? What's the sample size? How long was the study? How specific was it? Number 8, how does this align with what you already know to be true from other sources? Or is it something from out of the blue that doesn't fit? Number 9, is the source giving you value, or are they only selling? And keep in mind where research funding comes from as you look at that. Number 10, is this specific information, individualized information, or is it generalized information? Is this a fortune cookie, or is this specifically information that applies to you? And number 11, build that list of go-to sources that you can trust. Now, as I said, I want to wrap this up with the poem that my husband wrote for me for Valentine's Day using ChatGPT. I also want to share just a couple of things here really quick. For those of you who I know there's a lot of fibromyalgia bloggers and things that follow this podcast. So I want to give you a couple of tips too on how AI can be used effectively. It's most effectively used for things like writing an outline that you then edit and flesh out. So ChatGPT could write an outline talking about maybe medications to treat fibromyalgia. And then you go through and you add in your personal experience or your client's experience with that. So that's just an example. Number 2, AI can be used very effectively for generating ideas. So for instance, I could go in and ask for podcast episode ideas for the Fibromyalgia podcast. I could put in a blog article that I've written and asked it to generate some ideas for titles. I could ask it what kinds of guests might be good to have on the Fibromyalgia podcast. So it's really good at generating those kinds of ideas. It's also good at creating a summary. So this is the third one. Again, putting in that whole blog post and say, please summarize this for me. That can be really helpful. Okay. So here's my Valentine's love poem from my honey and ChatGPT. Valentine's Day is a time for love, for flowers, chocolates, and cooing doves. But for those with fibromyalgia and pain, it can be hard to feel the same. Tacos, on the other hand, bring delight, their savory goodness, a pure delight. For those with sensitive tummies and flares, they're a go-to food with which to pair. So on this Valentine's Day, let us embrace the joy of love, tacos, and their combined grace. With a heart full of love and a taco in hand, we can find comfort and joy in every strand. Fibromyalgia may make things tough, but with love and tacos, we have enough to get us through the hardest days and find happiness in so many ways. So on this Valentine's Day, let us give thanks for the love and the tacos that fill our ranks and celebrate with all our might the joy of love, tacos, and life's delight. That is my Valentine's Day poem from my husband and ChatGPT. And the prompt he gave it was to write a poem for Valentine's Day about fibromyalgia and tacos. So that's where the tacos came from. So with that, I want to give you this week's listener shout out. This is from Kim in North Carolina, and she just sent us a sweet little note that said, I just found your podcast last week. It's amazing and so helpful. Thank you so much for that, Kim, and thanks for being here. I'm so glad that you're finding the podcast helpful. And we'll wrap it up with a line from my Valentine's Day poem that I just love. Fibromyalgia may make things tough, but with love and tacos, we have enough. See you back here next time. And that wraps up another episode of the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tammy Stacklehouse. For daily doses of hope, inspiration, and practical advice, come hang out with me on Facebook. Visit facebook.com/fibrocoach to find my personal coaching page and connect with me directly. To find the show notes, additional resources, or to schedule a consultation with me or one of my coaches, visit fibromyalgiapodcast.com.